Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. Today's pod investigates a hot topic, hydrogen, by which I mean primarily green hydrogen. Hardly a week goes by without announcements of several hundred megawatts of electrolyzer capacity or plans to produce a huge amount of green hydrogen by 2030 or 2050. But will these plans see the light of day? Is green hydrogen the key to unlocking the net zero puzzle? Or is it the last hurrah of the fossil fuel industry? In particular, I'd like to discuss the use cases. In what sectors does green hydrogen make sense, and where does it not? Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, to discuss this and much, much more are Paul Martin, consultant with Spitfire Research. A warm welcome to you, Paul.
Hello.
And Jan Cihlar of Guidehouse, a consultancy. Great to have you too.
Glad to be here. Hello.
Every week we see almost, see a new project, a green hydrogen project be announced in Europe and beyond. Now, what's your view here, Jan? Will we see these projects that are in the pipeline, will they actually be realized?
I think many of them will. And what a lot of these projects were waiting for, or the investors and the project developers were waiting for, is the regulatory framework for them to actually come into place. I think many of your listeners will know that the European Commission released the draft proposal for the gas decarbonization package and also a couple of other important regulatory proposals. So once the clarity is on the table, and once, for some of these projects, of course, subsidies, state aid type of things can be also linked to them, you will see the first FIDs, the final investment decisions actually starting to be signed. Up until now, I think there was a lot of announcement, very little actual on-the-ground things happening, but I think that might start changing soon.
So, the European Commission plans to have 5 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity installed in Europe by 2024 and 40 gigawatts by 2030. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's in the 2030 European hydrogen strategy indeed, and up to 10 million tons of renewable and low carbon hydrogen by that date as well.
And you think this is feasible? Seems very ambitious.
Yeah, it seems very ambitious. It depends a little bit from my view. What do you assume are the lead times for these large-scale electrolyzer plants to be installed? So depending on who you talk to, this might take up to 7 years. We are in 2022 now. There is a lot of plans, but just to get all the permitting done and to actually make all the necessary preparations, it will take quite some time. So I think we might hit it if things start rolling now. But yeah, that really depends on how fast some of these things can get undersigned.
Well, I know you're based in Toronto, but we have maybe a little bit of a European bubble here. But what's your view of these very ambitious plans that are announced by global firms often?
Well, I'm seen as a hydrogen skeptic, and I'm not a hydrogen skeptic at all. I'm a hydrogen as a fuel skeptic. So my concern here is not with the making of green hydrogen, which I think is wonderful and I encourage it. My concern is the wasting of any green hydrogen that we may happen to make for purposes that don't make sense, like trying to replace natural gas as a fuel. The real uses for green hydrogen, the appropriate uses, the no regret uses for any green hydrogen we may happen to make, are not uses of hydrogen as a fuel. They're uses of hydrogen to replace black hydrogen. I don't go for these euphemisms, by the way. There's no such thing as gray or brown hydrogen. All hydrogen in the world right now, substantially all of it, is black. It's 30% at barest minimum blacker than the fossil fuels that it's made from without carbon capture. And that's the reality of hydrogen today. Hydrogen today is a massive decarbonization problem that we haven't even scratched the surface of solving. And yet we have people frothing at the mouth, hyperbolizing about future uses of hydrogen as a fuel when they haven't even replaced the hydrogen that's necessary as a chemical in the marketplace yet. So I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. I think we have to be very careful about that. I also think we have to be very careful about confusing wishes or desires or possible future outcomes with real earnest decarbonization effort.
2-3 years ago, green hydrogen, or hydrogen even, was hardly talked about in the move to decarbonize Europe's energy systems. But now it seems to be a very hot topic, as I mentioned in the intro. What's your view here, Jan? Why the sudden attention on green hydrogen?
I interpret this in the following way. I think that the narrative, how to decarbonize, and the question was always 2050, right? So it was kind of the end state where in Europe, we started saying, hey, we want to be net zero. And that's a euphemism, by the way, as well, the net zero. But let's assume that we want to be net zero from climate perspective by 2050. And I remember the discussion a couple of years ago when the essential main stream of thoughts was, well, let's electrify absolutely everything. Let's electrify transport. Let's electrify building heating, even the high industrial heat demand. And well, then let's just decarbonize power. Okay, problem solved. But then some smart people started looking into how that would actually, what that would mean for, say, the electricity network, and so both on the transmission and distribution level. Is that even feasible to get there with the amounts of electricity that would have to be deployed? And well, many people concluded that that seems to be quite unrealistic, including ourselves, by the way. So we started looking for, say, what else could we actually do there, right? How could we make this efforts to be more maybe feasible by 2050, but also generally, how do we make it more efficient? And one of the big things that pop up, we actually started originally with biofuels. So we in Europe, our studies quantified the maximum sustainable feedstock production for biofuels, so biomethane and bioliquids. And then on top of that, we tried to analyze how much other renewable gases could we potentially use in a cost-efficient manner in the system. And I think that's what touches to what Paul already said before. So there is some hierarchy to how you want to use these gases, and that goes both for the biogases or bioliquids and for the hydrogen, green hydrogen that you produce. So that's kind of the way that we have been thinking about that. And I think, many people now also recognize that that might be actually in the end the more feasible and more effective way to reach the net zero target by 2050.
When you say there are limits to electrification, what do you mean there, Jan? What in particular? Why do you see that as an issue here?
Right. So if you look at, for instance, the distribution networks in, the countries that I know quite well, that's Netherlands and Germany, the biggest problem right now is that they are completely congested. And a lot of that has to do with residential solar. But overall, we will have to essentially massively reinforce the lines on distribution level everywhere. That issue gets, of course, reinforced once you start having a electric vehicle in almost every household, unless then you have something like vehicle to grid operation. That gets even more reinforced if you have heat pumps everywhere. The numbers are staggering, right? So we are using more than 2,000 terawatt hours a year of natural gas right now to heat our homes. That's really a massive number, and we need to somehow deliver a part of that energy still to the homes. I mean, of course, you would want to insulate them much better than they are now. Heat pumps are more efficient, but still, just the reinforcement that would need to be done on the distribution system are massive. And to some extent, the same thing has to happen on the transmission level. If you look at the current resistance towards that, and by that I mean kind of the not in my yard type of resistance, it's massive in many European countries already, and we are nowhere near of being where we need to be. So that's where I come from.
Maybe we can turn to discuss electrification later, Paul, but hydrogen, green hydrogen as a fuel. You mentioned you're strongly skeptical to this. I mean, it's being touted as perhaps an answer in the transport sector, but that seems to be you've been very critical of that.
Absolutely. So the problem here, as I mentioned, is that hydrogen is a massive decarbonization problem as opposed to a decarbonization solution to much of anything. And the numbers that were being bandied about there, certainly decarbonizing by making the grid the primary source of energy is a huge effort, but it's actually been done. If you look at the growth in electrical distribution and production between the 1950s and the 1970s, the effort is really on that order. We've just been used to low growth for a long time. The other thing that's going on here is that there's quite a sunk cost fallacy happening where people are saying, well, there's a natural gas infrastructure that exists. Why not use it? Because that means we'll have to do less with the grid. And the problem is you can't use the transmission infrastructure for natural gas for pure hydrogen. You just cannot do it. You need to replace basically the entirety of the high and medium pressure transmission infrastructure, the pipelines that carry the gas long distances between countries, for instance, and all of the compressors in the network. The distribution piping that carries gas from the street to each individual home, that stuff would probably be fine with hydrogen. But again, the challenges here with hydrogen as a fuel, especially for heating, but also for transport, are that hydrogen is neither efficient nor effective as a heating fuel. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So we gladly and gratefully trade efficiency for effectiveness when that's an option for us. And the perfect example is the gasoline car. I mean, smaller gasoline engines are not very efficient at all. They're on the order of 25% thermally efficient. But gasoline as a fuel is so effective. I mean, you can pour it from a container, and the energy density per unit mass and per unit volume is extremely high. It's a liquid at room temperature, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a wonderful, effective fuel, except, of course, for the fact that the fossil greenhouse gas emissions that are generated when it's combusted are just not feasible to collect from each individual vehicle as it drives down the road. So the problem with hydrogen is that it's neither efficient nor effective. There are too many steps in the process of making hydrogen, transmitting and storing it, and then converting it back into mechanical energy or electricity again. And the cycle efficiency as a result of each of those steps being multiplied one by another, the resulting efficiency chain is very poor. I mean, an absolute best case to convert electricity to hydrogen and then store it, even in the most perfunctory way, not even transmit it anywhere, and then convert it back to electricity, the very best case is 37%. So round numbers, feed 3 kilowatt hours in, get 1 kilowatt hour out. That's a very, very bad battery, isn't it? Certainly seems like a very bad battery to me. And then on top of it, you have this ineffectiveness. So the energy density per unit volume is very, very low. I mean, considerably lower than the fuels we're used to. And for transport, honestly, cars and light trucks, that ship sailed. Battery electric vehicles are a much, much better option. They are adequately or more than adequately effective. And they're 3 times as efficient. So, that ship sailed. And I am confident that it will go the same way for heavy trucks. And then you're left with jet aircraft. Hydrogen is a terrible fuel choice for jet aircraft because jet aircraft have to push their fuel through the air. So how big the fuel is, its energy density per unit volume, matters greatly to how much cargo and how many passengers an aircraft can carry. And you're left with ships. And honestly, ships are extremely troublesome, but they're going to decarbonize last. And this is the thing that really kind of irritates me about the whole discussion, is that there's all this focus, and I think an inordinate focus on these hard to decarbonize sectors when there are easy to decarbonize sectors right in front of us. And electric vehicles are the perfect example of that. Total cost of ownership is actually lower for an battery electric vehicle today than for a gasoline or a diesel vehicle. And any decarbonization benefit that is achieved comes to the owner of that vehicle at a negative cost. So it's so obvious. We should be pursuing that aggressively instead of worrying about what are we going to do about home heating, for instance, which is a much longer term thing.
Even despite the problems in the distribution grid.
Yeah, the problems of the distribution grid, as I mentioned, it's very similar to the problems of the distribution grid between the 1950s and the 1970s. If we were presented with the problem of going from 1950s grid infrastructure to 1970s grid infrastructure today, we'd throw up our hands and say it's impossible. But it happened. We did it because we were motivated to do it.
Before I turn to Jan and your views on the use cases for green hydrogen, if I can stick with you, Paul, there's a big, not a million miles away from here. In Sweden, a lot's been made of using green hydrogen in the manufacture of steel. Now, what do you make of that?
That's a great use case for any green hydrogen we might happen to make. And the reason for that is that hydrogen is not being used as a fuel. It's being used as a chemical reducing agent. And in fact, it's being used to replace synthesis gas, which is a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide that's made largely from natural gas, where actually 10% of hydrogen production in the world right now is used for that purpose, for the direct reduction of iron ores to iron metal in the form of what they call hot briquetted iron. So it's an existing use for hydrogen that we would be replacing with pure hydrogen. It's a great use case.
You mentioned decarbonizing black hydrogen or, the fossil fuel. So this is are there any other such use cases?
Absolutely. Ammonia is the most important one by far. I mean, we are so dependent on ammonia. Literally, half the people on Earth would not be here if it wasn't for Haber-Bosch ammonia. if you were to look at the nitrogen atoms in the proteins in your own body, half of those came from Haber-Bosch. Okay, half of those came from the process by which we take hydrogen and react it with nitrogen from the atmosphere to make ammonia, and then we make chemicals like urea and nitrates and so on, which we use as nitrogen fertilizers for the growing of food. And while we must reduce how much of those nitrogen fertilizers we use by being better at agriculture, that's something we must do, because there's also greenhouse gas emissions of nitrous oxide that are generated by that use. I like eating. I don't think we should really be worrying about what kind of fuel we're using in Porsches so much as how we're going to continue to eat in a decarbonized future. And as a consequence, that's got to be the focus of any green hydrogen we make. But I think it's really important to look at how huge a challenge just decarbonizing hydrogen is, because I don't think people really have a perspective on that. And it's actually a very simple little bit of math. So right now we make about 120 million tons of hydrogen per year between pure hydrogen and synthesis gas hydrogen. And of that, perhaps 90 million tons will be needed in a decarbonized future, because 30 million tons will no longer be needed because they're being used to desulfurize fossil fuels before we burn them. So in the future, we'll need 90 million tons of hydrogen between pure hydrogen and synthesis gas. And to make that using electricity at 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram, which is a really exceptionally good electrolyzer, would take 4,500 terawatt hours of electricity. And in all of the world in 2019, which are the most recent figures that I have, we only made 2,100 terawatt hours of wind and solar in the entire world. So just the effort to make black hydrogen green would take a doubling of wind and solar relative to 2019 and then some. And that would actually amount to, if you use those electrolyzers at 50% capacity factor, because the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine continuously, you would need 1,000 gigawatts of electrolyzers. And, these factories that people are building now, they're touting potential capacity to make 1 gigawatt of electrolyzers per year. So you see, it just boggles the mind that people are concluding that we're going to have excess green hydrogen lying around to waste as a transport or heating fuel, when just the task of greening that black hydrogen that we depend on for our very lives through ammonia and the like would take such a tremendous investment. It's just premature by decades and decades.
What's your view here, Jan? Where do you see the use cases?
There is a lot to unpack here, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, let's start from the beginning, I think. Yeah, I think I do not disagree, of course, with Paul, that there are clear use cases in industry to decarbonize the current, say, black hydrogen usage. That should be the first use case, obviously. And I think very few reasonable people are debating that. One of the interesting future increases in demand could indeed come from the steel industry. That will be the primary production route for steel, unless we really fully can move to steel recycling, which is unlikely. We'll need some kind of reducing agent, and hydrogen looks like the most promising. There's multiple projects that have been announced already in Europe that are pursuing that path. Maybe you saw that a couple of months ago in the Hybrid project in Sweden, they actually made the first ingot produced exactly just using hydrogen in the DRI setup. So that's quite clear. And that indeed is already a tremendous amount. But in Europe, and I can just talk from the European perspective here, we already plan to have more than half of that black hydrogen replaced by green by 2030. So it's not decades away, it's now. And there are concrete plans from the European Commission and from the nation governments to reach that target and maybe even go beyond that. Now, beyond industry, you talk transport, and I think I personally agree that I don't really see hydrogen being used in fuel cells in passenger vehicles or in trucks. I think that, or buses maybe even. That is probably a very fringe use case. But in terms of airplanes, not hydrogen directly, but synthetic fuels, we will have to, if we want to continue flying, there are two decisions, and I think, Paul, you often say that as well. There are two decisions. So either we're going to all stop flying, okay, option one, or option two, we have to find some very expensive sustainable fuel. And that could be either biofuels, or it could be something like a synthetic kerosene that's made of hydrogen. Both of these production routes require green hydrogen input or hydrogen input. The synthetic kerosene route much more, actually extreme amounts, if you would like to just fully run the current airplanes on a decarbonized fuel. And maritime is the other one that you mentioned. And there are already concrete plans from several of the shipping operators in Europe, and they have started investing into, again, synthetic fuels. So the biggest one that they are exploring is synthetic methanol. And I must disagree that this is I understand where you come from, that this should be something that we decarbonize last, because that makes logical sense. But these ships are being built for decades. They are being built for 50 years. So if you don't start now, if you don't start switching now, we're going to be too late. And there is a problem to that, obviously, that in the short term, we might just not have enough of those green fuels and all that. But that's something that we have to take, I think, into consideration. And we have to have also the long-term view in mind. And that goes with all of these things. So if we, for instance, say, if there is any decision that we would like to have these systems ready for hydrogen by 2050 at a large scale, well, we have to start now. Maybe we are already a bit late. I'll just finish off maybe with the two other big demand segments. The buildings, I think it's extremely complicated and nobody really knows the answer to that, how exactly to decarbonize, especially building heating demand. Heat pumps seems to be, of course, the more effective and efficient solution there. What we have been exploring quite a bit is also what we call a hybrid heat pump setup, where in some of the hard to insulate buildings, you keep actually the existing natural gas boiler, but then you feed biomethane into the gas grid instead of the natural gas, and that complements the heat pump. And then the big question really for me is what do you do with the power system itself, especially in terms of long-term energy storage? In Europe, we experience in the last couple of months, I think, the largest wind drought that has been here, at least since I have been looking at the figures, meaning that in winter, where energy demand, of course, is very high, we had almost zero wind for weeks and weeks on, and we had, of course, no sun whatsoever. So I think that this really clearly shows us that we have to find a way how to bridge multiple weeks of very low and wind and sun production across Europe. It was really across Europe. So we will need to find something, a medium that can help us store very large amounts of energy for multiple weeks. And so I'm curious how else than with something like that we would do that.
2 quick points. First of all, I agree 100% that aircraft, the logical solution there are only two. It's either biofuels or it's e-fuels. So fuels that are made from hydrogen. Honestly, that's what e-fuels really are. They're not made from electricity. They're made from hydrogen that's made from electricity. Biofuels make a lot more sense at much, much lower cost to jet aircraft passengers. So I think they're the logical choice there. And if we're going to use hydrogen, green hydrogen for aircraft, it's going to be to increase biofuels yields. As far as shipping is concerned, the problem is that shipping already using the cheapest garbage fuel, fossil fuel that they can buy, the cost per ton mile of shipping is basically 40 to 60% fuel cost. And as a consequence, they're extremely cost sensitive. Now, if regulatory controls or taxes can force the shipping industry to decarbonize, it's going to do so at greatly higher cost. And so that's the trouble that I see here. By all means, make ships dual fuel, as Maersk, for instance, has done with 8 ships to great fanfare. But let's be realistic. Those ships are going to run on fossil fuel because it's greatly cheaper for as long as the regulatory program will allow them to do so. And they're only going to transition to a much, much more expensive fuel per joule or BTU or whatever unit of energy you wish to use when they're forced to, because the economic imperative will drive them to use the cheapest fuel that they possibly can. Otherwise, they're going to be considerably economically disadvantaged relative to their competition who don't care about climate change.
A fascinating discussion, gentlemen. I'd just like to round off by asking you, Paul, a lot has been made in Europe, especially given the situation that Jan mentioned in terms of the very low wind output that we've seen this winter, combined with the gas crisis, that there's talk of hydrogen-ready gas-fired plants. So what do you make of this? I mean, you've said before that a lot of the industry here, or the hydrogen industry, is selling us a fossil fuel with a thick, obscuring coat of greenwash. Is this an example of that, would you say?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. So I think you really would have to be a naive person to imagine that the fossil fuel industry, and particularly the fossil fuel distribution industry, those people that are making a living right now distributing natural gas to consumers, see hydrogen as anything other than an existential thing for their future. I mean, they require it. Otherwise, they'll have to pack up and find something else to do for a living. So they're going to sell you hard on the notion that hydrogen is something that they can deliver, and in fact, that they can even make from fossil resources without making too much greenhouse gas emission. They're going to sell you hard on that possibility. And dual fueling or fuel blending hydrogen into natural gas to kind of marginally improve its greenhouse gas emissions. Those are strategies of the fossil fuel industry to prolong its existence and, in fact, to delay real decarbonization, in my opinion. Recalling that we were talking a moment ago about the cold, dark, calm periods when there's no wind in the middle of the winter and the solar panels are covered in snow. Those conditions are very real, and you need stored fuels for that purpose. It's absolutely necessary. There's no way batteries or anything else like that will cover those 2-week periods. So if you're going to store fuels, it makes logical sense to store fuels that you already have access to. As an example, if we burn even fossil natural gas for 2 weeks a year, we've already dealt with the global warming problem largely. And that seems to me to be the least expensive and most practical alternative for dealing with the cold, dark, calm period. The other alternative, the thing that people are talking about, is the possibility of making hydrogen in the summer for use in the winter to store it all the way through season. And the challenge is that even when you make hydrogen continuously at as high a capacity factor as you can, using electricity as your starting material, it's expensive due to the fact that the electrolyzers cost a lot of money. And if you only use them infrequently, the contribution of the cost of that capital per kilogram of hydrogen is too high. And then if you only use them half the year because you want to store the hydrogen made in the summer for use in the winter, it just doubles that cost. So the cost to reduce a very small amount of emissions that happen only 2 weeks a year, could be very, very high. And so I don't really see that as a good way to proceed. And I think much ado has been made about the cold, dark, calm periods, more so than perhaps they deserve in terms of actually being a decarbonization problem.
Keeping gas-fired plants on for in reserve for just those 2 weeks is also not cheap, I'd expect.
Absolutely. You're dead right. Anything that we do for that 2-week period is not going to be cheap, but we have to do it. And as my good friend used to say about his the way he had to be very careful about how he ate because of his type 2 diabetes, life is easy when you have no choice. So our choice is we have to store fuels. We have no choice. The question is not whether we have to do it. The question is which fuels.
Absolutely. And thank you, gentlemen, for a fascinating discussion once again and being guests on the Montel Weekly podcast this week.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or, let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.